You'll never be more than an ER nurse playing dress-up, my mother said, smoothing the lapel of my stepfather's tuxedo jacket like she was polishing a trophy. Your sister married a man who owns half of downtown. What do you have? Scrubs that smell like other people's blood. She reached across the dinner table and snatched the wedding invitation right out of my hands before I'd even finished reading it, and folded it in half with a snap so sharp it cracked down the crease. I'm not putting your name on the guest list. Paramedics don't sit with senators. I felt that fold happen inside my own chest. I'd pulled a double the night before. 16 hours on my feet in the trauma bay at Cedar Grove Memorial, the kind of shift where you stop counting the codes you've run and start just moving from one to the next on muscle memory. I still had the smell of antiseptic in my hair. When I sat down at that table, still had a bruise on my forearm from holding pressure on a gunshot wound for 11 straight minutes until the surgical team could get him open. And my mother looked at me across her good china and decided that the most important thing happening in our family that week was that I wasn't going to embarrass her in front of my sister's new in-laws. My husband Caleb didn't say a word. He just set his fork down, quiet, the way he does right before he decides something. Caleb drives a tow truck for the county, the kind that hauls jackknifed semis off the interstate in the middle of an ice storm at 2 a.m. His hands are permanently nicked up from chain hooks and frozen steel cable. My mother has never once asked him a question about his work that wasn't really an insult wearing a question's clothes. I stood up from that table with my spine straight, the way you learn to stand when you've spent a decade telling families in a hallway that their husband or their son isn't coming home. I didn't raise my voice. I just said, understood, and I took Caleb's hand and we left. She had no idea what was coming for her in 3 days. 3 days later, while 500 guests in rented tuxedos and $10,000 gowns were lifting champagne flutes at the Whitcomb estate outside the city, 2 unmarked black SUVs pulled into my mother's circular driveway, and 4 federal marshals walked up to her front door holding a folder with my name typed across the top in block letters. What happened after that is the only time in my entire life I watched her face actually stop performing. But I need to take you back to where this really started. Because the wedding wasn't the first time my mother decided I was the discount daughter. I grew up the second of 2 girls in a split-level house outside Cleveland, and from about the time I was 9 years old, I understood the math of our family without anyone ever explaining it to me out loud. My older sister, Brielle, was the one who got modeling lessons and braces and a car for her 16th birthday. I got hand-me-downs and a part-time job at the pharmacy counter starting at 14, because, in my mother's words, somebody in this house has to learn the value of $1, and it isn't going to be her. My father wasn't around to balance any of it out. He died when I was 8. He drove a delivery route for a regional grocery distributor, the kind of job where you're on your feet loading pallets in a freezing warehouse before the sun comes up, and one February morning, the truck in front of him jackknifed on black ice on I-90, and he didn't make it home. I remember my mother crying for exactly 9 days, and on the 10th day she started telling people that my father had been a regional logistics executive, which made it sound like he wore a tie to work instead of steel-toed boots. She threw away the photo of him in his work uniform leaning against the truck, the one I loved most, because she said it didn't represent who we were. What he left me was a folding pocket knife with a worn bone handle, the one he used to break down cardboard boxes on his route. He'd let me hold it when I was little and tell me, every tool earns its keep, Sloan. So do you. Don't ever let anybody tell you different. That knife lived in the bottom of my bag through nursing school, through 3 different ERs, through every overnight shift where I needed something in my pocket to remind me where I came from. The year I turned 18, I got into the nursing program at a state school 2 hours away, full scholarship on top of a partial grant, the kind of acceptance letter you frame. My mother read it, standing at the kitchen counter, folded it once, and used it to start the charcoal in the grill, because Brielle had just been accepted to a pricier private school for image consulting, and apparently there wasn't enough emotional bandwidth in our house to celebrate 2 daughters in the same month. You'll get there your own way, she told me, not even looking up from the grill. You're going to wait tables and figure it out like everybody else. I worked the breakfast shift at a diner 6 days a week for the next 4 years to pay for what that scholarship didn't cover. Because somehow even the scholarship money got redirected toward Brielle's tuition before I understood what was happening to it. That diner job is also where I met Caleb. He used to come in every morning at 5:30 before his shift, order the same black coffee and 2 eggs over easy, and tip more than the meal cost even when he clearly didn't have it to spare. We got married 4 years later in the back garden of his aunt's house, 60 guests, a borrowed sound system, and a cake from the grocery store bakery. My mother sat in the second row, dabbing her eyes with a tissue, and I actually believed for about an hour that she was happy for me, Until I overheard her in the parking lot afterward telling my aunt that she'd raised one daughter for greatness and apparently birthed the other one for a tow yard. The cruelty had a rhythm to it. 2 years ago, I was working a particularly brutal stretch of nights in the trauma unit, the kind where you go home and just stand in the shower until the hot water runs out because it's the only way to wash the day off your skin, and my mother called me at 4 in the morning. Not to ask how I was holding up. She wanted to know if I could float her $15,000 for Brielle's engagement photos and a custom gown fitting. Because Brielle had found the one, and image mattered now more than ever. I told her I didn't have $15,000 sitting around. I had student loans and a mortgage on a house that still needed a new roof. She told me I was selfish, that I'd always been selfish, that some people are just born without the gene for family loyalty. I sent her $4,000 anyway, because some habits you don't break overnight, even when you should. What my mother never knew, what nobody in my family ever knew, is what happened 11 months before that phone call, on a stretch of overpass on the edge of the city during the worst ice storm we'd had in a decade. I wasn't on shift that night. I was driving home from a continuing education class, taking the long way because the highway was a parking lot of stalled cars, when I came around a bend and saw a charter bus jackknifed against the guardrail, half hanging over the edge of the overpass, its undercarriage already smoking. Inside were 41 people, most of them elderly, coming back from a casino trip. The driver was slumped over the wheel, unresponsive. I could see flames starting to lick up from somewhere near the rear axle. I didn't think. I grabbed the emergency kit out of my trunk, called it in, and went up the embankment in the sleet in my work scrubs because that's what I'd had on. The bus door was jammed shut from the impact. I forced it open with a tire iron, climbed inside, and started moving people, one at a time, down a slope of solid ice in the dark with smoke filling the cabin behind me. An elderly man near the back, easily 80 years old, couldn't walk. His hip had taken the worst of the impact. I carried him myself, fireman style, down that embankment while the bus behind us finally caught and the flames lit up the whole overpass orange. I went back up twice more. By the time the fire department arrived, I'd gotten 31 of the 41 passengers clear. I had second-degree burns across both forearms, from where I'd had to push through a section of the cabin already catching, and I didn't feel any of it until I was sitting in the back of an ambulance an hour later, shaking so hard a paramedic had to hold the coffee cup to my mouth for me. 2 days after that, in a private hospital room with my arms wrapped in gauze, a man in a gray suit walked in with 2 staffers trailing behind him and introduced himself as senior counsel for Senator Harlan Greaves. The senator's mother, it turned out, had been the elderly woman sitting 2 rows ahead of the man I'd carried down the embankment, and she hadn't survived the wait for a second ambulance because there wasn't one fast enough. But the man I'd carried, the one with the broken hip, was Senator Greaves's father-in-law, a retired federal judge named Walton Pierce, and the senator wanted to thank me personally, in front of cameras, with a key to the city and a commendation ceremony. I said no. I asked them to keep my name out of it entirely. I told the council that I didn't do it for a plaque, and that the only thing I wanted was to never have to talk about that night again. Because the truth was, I went home that week and dreamed about the smoke for months. They respected it. The story ran with no name attached, just an off-duty nurse. My mother read about it in the local paper at her own kitchen table and had no idea the off-duty nurse in those 3 short paragraphs was sitting across from her at Thanksgiving 4 days later, being told her stuffing wasn't as good as Brielle's mother-in-law's. The morning of Brielle's wedding, while 500 guests gathered at the Whitcomb estate, I put on regular clothes, got in my car, and drove 40 minutes out to Restland Cemetery instead. I walked the rows until I found my father's headstone, the cheap granite one my mother picked because it was on sale, the one I'd quietly paid to have re-engraved years later with the words he actually deserved. I knelt down, cleared the leaves off the base, and sat there for almost an hour telling him about the bus, about the wedding I wasn't invited to, about all of it, the way you talk to somebody you know can't answer but you need to say it out loud anyway. On my way back to the car, my phone buzzed, a text from Caleb. A photo of a paper bag sitting on our porch steps, a handwritten note taped to the outside in my mother's looping cursive, leftover crab cakes from the reception. Figured someone in scrubs doesn't get food like this very often. Stay home next time, and you won't have to wonder what you missed. I stood in that cemetery and read it twice, and something in my chest that had been bending for 30 years finally quietly stopped bending. I drove home. Caleb met me at the door, the bag still sitting unopened on the step where the courier had left it. Without a word, he picked it up, walked it around to the side of the house, and dropped it straight into the trash can. The lid banged shut. We sat at our kitchen table and didn't talk about it, because there wasn't anything left to say that the silence wasn't already saying better. That's when the deep rumble of engines rolled up our street. Caleb went to the window first. 4 black SUVs, federal plates, were pulling into formation outside our small rental house, boxing in the driveway. Men in dark suits stepped out in unison, 8 of them, moving with the kind of coordination that doesn't belong to a routine visit. My stomach dropped, not from guilt, but from the simple, electric confusion of someone who can't think of a single reason this should be happening to her. I walked out onto the porch. The lead marshal, a woman with silver hair pulled back tight and a folder tucked under one arm, stopped at the bottom step. Sloan Whitfield Calloway? Not my legal married name, my full name, including the maiden name almost nobody used anymore. I confirmed it. She held up identification. Senator Greaves has requested your presence, today. We were told it was time-sensitive. The timing detonated in my head before she even finished the sentence. 11 months of silence, and now, on the exact afternoon of my sister's wedding, the bus came roaring back into my life like the fire had never actually gone out, just been smoldering underneath everything since. Give me 5 minutes, I said. I went inside and changed into the one good navy dress I owned, the one I'd bought for a cousin's funeral and never had another occasion for. I didn't put on jewelry. I didn't need to. Caleb stood in the bedroom doorway, watching me, and when I turned around, he just nodded once. The kind of nod that means more than every word either of us could have found. The convoy moved fast, sirens cutting through traffic that scrambled out of our way like it had been rehearsed. 40 minutes later, we turned down a private road lined with old oaks toward the Whitcomb estate, where uniformed valets dove out of the way as 4 SUVs blew straight through the entrance gate without slowing, tires tearing across the white carpet laid out for the wedding party. A waiter dropped a tray of champagne flutes. The string quartet went silent mid-note. 500 heads turned at once. I stepped out in that plain navy dress, no medals, no uniform, nothing but my own 2 feet on the marble, and walked through a corridor of federal agents toward the head table, where my mother's face had already drained the color of dishwater. Senator Harlan Greaves himself came through the crowd next, an older man beside him leaning on a cane, moving slow but steady. Walton Pierce, the judge whose life I'd carried down an icy embankment with my oarsome. He reached me first, took both my hands in his, and his voice carried clean across the entire terrace. This is the woman who pulled me out of a burning bus and went home without telling a single soul. I owe her my life. My daughter's family owes her a debt we can never repay. 500 guests went dead silent, and then the applause came up like a wave breaking, the kind of sound that doesn't build slowly, just arrives all at once. Senator Greaves turned to my mother next, his voice dropping into something colder, sharper. You told my office, when we called this house looking for her 2 weeks ago, that your daughter was unavailable for that sort of thing, and that we should speak to your other daughter's husband instead, since he was more appropriate for this kind of recognition. You tried to redirect a congressional commendation toward your son-in-law's company for a rescue you knew nothing about. He let that sit in the air. Did you think we wouldn't find out you mortgaged this event against a loan you can't repay, banking on your other daughter, marrying into money fast enough to cover it before anyone noticed? My mother's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Brielle, 3 feet away in her wedding gown, looked at her new husband, and her new husband looked at her like he was seeing a stranger for the first time. I found out later, much later, that the prenuptial agreement his family's lawyers had drafted included a fraud clause my mother had quietly encouraged Brielle to sign without reading closely, the kind of clause that activates the second anyone discovers the marriage was built on a manufactured story. Within 6 weeks, Brielle walked away from that marriage with nothing but the dress on her back, the dress my mother had financed, with a second mortgage on a house that went to the bank by spring. My mother texted me every week after that. Long messages about family and forgiveness and one phone call that could fix everything. I read maybe the first 3. Then I stopped opening them at all. Caleb and I went home that night to our small kitchen with the chipped mug and the leaky faucet that still needed fixing, and he made coffee, black, no sugar, and we sat there in the quiet, and I thought about my father's pocket knife in the bottom of my bag, about 31 strangers who got to go home to their families because I didn't think twice on an icy overpass, about a mother who spent 30 years measuring my worth in the wrong currency entirely. The strongest people I've ever met in that trauma bay were never the ones bragging about what they had. They were the ones who showed up anyway, every single time, expecting nothing back. That's the only inheritance that ever mattered to me, and it's the one thing nobody, not even my own mother, could ever fold up and throw away.